I'm Jianying Tan, and you're listening to a Cell Paperclip. Remember the last time you recognized an old friend just by a random glance across the street? That doesn't take very long, right? So have you ever wondered how your brain does it? What's behind such a speedy and accurate recognition of a friendly face? Well, Dr. Doris Hao from Caltech certainly did, and she's about to tell us her most recent exciting findings in pursuing these questions. Doris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I must say face recognition is really fascinating. I mean, we all look differently from every different angle, and somehow it seems so effortless to just recognize each other, even those that we haven't seen for a while. So could you just tell us, before your work here, how do we think that brain gets this done, like how it works?
Yeah, so before this work that's described in this paper in Cell, people thought that at the highest levels of the brain's face recognition system, there are cells that are selective for specific individuals. You know, all the people that you know and recognize, there are cells coding them. And obviously this raised a question, which is, how can you have enough cells to represent all of the people that you could possibly recognize? Right? There's 6 billion people on this earth, and you don't have 6 billion cells specialized for face recognition in your brain. So it was a mystery how it's ultimately done.
What is the most exciting thing that you find here in terms of, I would assume that it's contradicting that prediction, right?
Yeah, I think there's several exciting things about our paper. I think the most exciting thing is that we actually now understand exactly what the computation is that these single face cells in the monkey face patches are doing. So, previously people had recorded from these cells, and they'd found that different cells would be selective for different subsets of individuals, right? So like one cell would respond to, these people, another cell would respond to a different set of people. It was totally unclear what the principles were. And now we understand that what these cells are actually doing is projecting a face onto a specific axis. And this model, contradicts the previous notion that single cells are coding specific individuals, but also gives us a comprehensive understanding of why cells are selected for any number of individuals. Right? So I think that's the most exciting thing, that we have this clear understanding of what these cells are doing, and the code that they're using actually turns out to be very simple. A consequence of this is that now we can actually just use the responses of around 200 cells, and we can decode almost perfectly exactly what face the monkey's seeing. So we can show the monkey an arbitrary face, and we can reconstruct that face from electrical activity around 200 neurons.
So while we're at it, when you just was saying in terms of the group of neurons projecting it to an axis, so just trying to understand, are you saying basically it's the same group of neurons recognize all the cells that we see, but they code it differently, or what that axis mean?
Yeah, so each cell is projecting a face onto a different axis, and the code for faces that's used by the brain turns out to be exactly analogous to how you code colors using R, G, and B. So, there's millions of possible colors that you can distinguish, and you can imagine one way of distinguishing these colors is to give each individual color a different name, like red, green, blue, yellow, periwinkle, chartreuse, and so on. And this is obviously, that's the analog of the idea that each cell is coding one individual. A much more efficient way to code colors is to encode each color by just 3 numbers, right? The amount of red, green, and blue. And for that scheme, you just need 3 cells. The face cells turn out to do the same thing as RGB code, except they're doing it in a much higher dimensional space. It's not 3-dimensional anymore. It's approximately 50-dimensional. But as you were saying, yes, it's the same set of cells are coding all the different faces, and it's the pattern of activity across these cells that distinguish the different faces. Same way that, if you just have like R, G, and B, it would be the same 3 cells coding all the different colors, but it just depends on the relative activation of R, G, and B.
So the second part you were just mentioning, basically you're saying in your study, you were able to use this code and plug in the responses of neurons basically to reconstruct what a monkey actually saw. So do you think that somehow maybe in the future that those kind of reconstruction and sort of our understanding of the code could potentially be used for, I don't know, like artificial intelligence or things like that, trying to understand how the brain basically project and understand those complex objects?
Yeah, I think that our work has some really deep implications for artificial intelligence. So on the one hand, right now, people are training all these deep networks to do these amazing things, but these deep networks still remain complete black boxes, right? Mm-hmm. No one understands exactly, how they're working. And there's even, quite some pessimism, I would say, in the field. And there's this notion that, it's impossible to understand, right? These units just have thousands of weights onto them, and how can you understand what it's actually computing in a simple way, right? So I think, there's just sort of an existential crisis right now going on in computational neuroscience, right? This notion that maybe it's not possible to understand things in a simple way. And so in our paper, we show that it's actually possible to understand these units very deep in the brain's object recognition network. And I imagine that using this same approach, we could actually, do the same experiments on these artificial deep networks and try to understand how the units in those networks are coding objects. Right. So the big message is that, if you look at the responses of cells in the correct space, then it turns out that the responses are extremely simple. In our case, we found that you could decode or reconstruct the face that the monkey's seeing with just a linear transformation of the responses.
What's your next step in terms of where you take this work?
I think that we really figured out the face patch system, and we really understand, how face coding is working. So the new directions we're taking are, one, we're trying to understand how other types of objects are coded. Mm-hmm. Right? These face patches that we record from this paper are embedded in this large brain region called IT cortex that's responsible for recognizing all of the objects that you see. Right. And so we want to know the extent to which these principles that we found for the face patch system generalize. But more broadly, I'm extremely interested in the problem of how the brain actually models the 3D world, right? So the cells that we've been studying, they're responsible for one part of the vision problem, which is how you recognize the face. But there's this whole other problem of how you see the three-dimensionality of the face and how you track the face as it's moving. And so we're recording in other parts of the brain to study that. And then finally, we're extremely interested in the problem of how top-down signals can modulate the processing in these face patches. For example, when you imagine a face, or you dream about a face, how does that work? How is your internal mind's eye able to trigger this vivid perception, right? So those are the big directions we're taking now.
Okay. Wow, that sounds very cool. Doris, thanks again and congratulations on the fascinating study. Dr. Doris Cao studies how brain works in recognition at Caltech. You can read her paper in the latest issue of Cell and at cell.com. I'm Jia Ying Tan, and you've been listening to a Cell Paperclip.